Hi, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning for some of you, and welcome to Surviving Presidential Turnover, President-Proofing Your Consortium, a webinar brought to you by the Virtual Professional Development Committee of this Association for Collaborative Leadership.
Jim, it looks like you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Excellent. Not sure what happened there. And for some reason, I cannot advance the slide. There we go. Introductions. I would like to introduce our panelists for today. Carole Chabries, Dean of the School of Adult Learning and New Initiatives for Alverno College in Milwaukee. Previously, Carole served as Executive Director of the Associated Colleges of the Twin Cities and as a member of the board of ACL. Carole has also served as Dean at Stevens College and was a member of the State of Minnesota's Collaborative Itasca Higher Ed Task Force. I would also like to introduce Karina Chavez, the Executive Director of the Pittsburgh Council on Higher Education. Prior to this role, Karina served as the Vice President of Student Affairs for the Art Institute System. Karina spent 10 years in the nonprofit sector as a community mediator and has earned degrees from the University of California, Irvine and the University of New South Wales in Australia. And I would also like to introduce Todd Greene, the Executive Director of the Atlanta University Center Consortium. Todd directs the world's oldest and largest contiguous association of historically Black colleges and universities. Todd previously served with the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta and as a faculty member at the Georgia Institute of Technology. So welcome to our panelists, a thank you to our panelists, and welcome to everybody who has joined us online. A couple of housekeeping things to cover. You attendees may use the Q&A function built into the Zoom platform to submit questions at any time. We will reserve some time at the end of the webinar to address questions, or as many as we can, that have been submitted via the Q&A function. If you have any technical needs or if you have any technical questions about the Q&A function, please submit a chat to Tim Newcomb, and Tim will be happy to help you out. This session is being recorded and will be made available afterwards on the ACL member website. And a webinar survey link is provided at the end of this PowerPoint, at the end of the presentation, but it will also be emailed to attendees, and we hope that you will take a few minutes to complete that survey when you receive it. A brief introduction to our topic today. Regardless of maturity and longevity, higher ed consortia are vulnerable to member institution presidential turnover. A departing champion president may have provided the cohesive factor for your consortium, and successors may not always perceive or acknowledge the value of the consortium. This webinar will focus on how consortium leaders can help ensure consortium stability following the turnover of member institution leadership. We have three learning objectives today: understanding the impact of presidential turnover on consortium, member institutions, and consortium leadership, recognizing the underlying dynamics of presidential turnover, and finally, articulating proactive measures intended to ensure consortium stability and effectiveness during and following presidential turnover. So we would like to start with our first learning objective, understanding the impact of presidential turnover. And we also want to give the audience a few seconds to ponder these two reflection questions. How often have you experienced presidential turnover at member institutions within your consortium? And what were the greatest challenges you experienced during these transitions? Let's take a few seconds. So as we are all anticipating, we would like to hear from our panelists now in response to Learning Objective 1. They will not necessarily answer the 2 questions that you see on the screen, but rather the 2 questions you see on the screen for the panel have been formulated to help guide the discussion. They won't necessarily be answering each specific question. Karina will start us off with her response to this learning objective, followed by Carole and then Todd. Karina?
Thanks, Jim. Well, to give you an understanding of my consortium, PCHE, or the Pittsburgh Council on Higher Education, has 10 member institutions and was formed in 1966. When I stepped into the role as executive director 4.5 years ago, 4 of those 10 presidents were brand new. The chair at the time was one of the most senior tenured presidents and was highly committed to PCHE, our consortium. So when I started this role, I had 4 brand new presidents, 2 at the 2 largest institutions, Carnegie Mellon University and University of Pittsburgh, as well as the Community College of Allegheny County, which is a system of 4 schools. And so at that time, we really hunkered down and were able to set up, establish our strategic priorities and stay focused on those. Since that time, though, I've had 5 presidents turnover. And so it really had depended on how those presidents left, for what reasons, and the type of institution that they were leaving, and also the state of those institutions. So the presidents that were retiring, and as 3 retire, those the presidents are incredibly close, and so the most valuable sort of asset of PCHE is their social capital. And so they were set off into retirement with fanfare and all the proper goodbyes, and others not the case. So in the ways that really impacted our consortium were the sort of length that those president openings, the length it took to fill them. Again, back to the reason why. And one of the biggest impacts was that our long-term initiatives that we had invested lots of time and energy for were jeopardized when we had turnover, particularly when that institution was the lead institution on that particular high-level initiative. And so, you know, there's lots of rippling that's happened throughout PCHE on different levels. But also, I would say that lost social capital amongst the presidents did have a lot of impact, and it was my job to get the new ones connected and embedded with the more tenured presidents, as well as figure out where the imbalances as far as influence and alliances amongst the groups. And so, you know, those are sort of some of the things that I wanted to touch on. And I don't know, I'll hand it over to Carole.
Great. Thanks, Karina. I'll start where you started, Karina, with a little bit of the history of ACTC. So I became its executive director in 2010. We were 35 years old at the time. And when I was brought on, the presidents had decided that they needed to find a way to reinvigorate the consortium. So they were clearly committed to it, but they weren't happy with the level of work that was happening. Fast forward to 2015, they voted to disband. So we spent 5 years responding to their strategic priorities, building the social capital that we could, and ultimately it wasn't enough. Presidential turnover definitely played a role in that. We had 2 presidents turnover during that time. But I would agree with Karina that the social capital of the presidents who are serving together on that board was more important than any one individual presidential turnover. I would also say one of the key pieces of kind of getting at maybe solving the impact of potential presidential turnover really has to do with the social capital with the president's cabinets. I think the president's cabinets can be even a stronger advocate than you might be able to as the executive director when a new president comes on board. And so there's a way for the onboarding, for your relationship, and for the cabinet to help bridge that transition into a successful new presidency. Todd, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, so thank you for this opportunity. So I represent a consortium that has been in existence for 90 years, Atlanta University Center Consortium, and currently we have 4 members, undergraduate as well as graduate schools that are part of our consortium. And through the years, the power and the influence and the approach of the consortium has certainly evolved with the times, and also based upon the kind of the construction of our conference of our Council of Presidents. And I would just echo the points that have been already mentioned, but I'll also maybe add another point, and that one has to do with personality and personality dynamics. So obviously our presidents all are leaders, and they are used to being in leadership positions. And in order to lead in a consortium environment, that may often require some adjustments, particularly when you are used to being in charge of something. And then now you are kind of working with others. So I think also really understanding how that leadership shows up. So and I'll just say that in some cases there may be an alpha or a dominant person who may be the person who ostensibly is wielding a certain sense of power or control. And then maybe it's the quiet person who may not, but really understanding and really getting behind how a new person comes in and that personality aspect and how that contributes to shaping how the consortium will actually operate, I think is an important consideration beyond what's been stated. The other thing that I'll just mention, and the question doesn't really particularly ask this, is how does this really impact operations? And I'll just mention that there's, in some cases, we've talked about very nice things about how presidents have left. So for example, in the example of presidents retiring, well, that isn't always the case. And in some cases, there may be a president who is brought in with the perception that they are there to undo or erase or eviscerate, in some cases, things that the previous president has done. So I think really understanding, at least having that in the back of your mind about, does this person think that this new broom has to sweep clean, and how does that reflect on the work of the consortium or not?
I want to pick up on Todd's comment quickly and say that personalities really do matter. And not only because a president might be used to being in charge, but also because sometimes presidents are new to being presidents. And so part of what they might be trying to negotiate is how to establish and kind of present themselves and take on for themselves the role of CEO, and if they've not done it before. And then to do that in a collaborative space, I think is more complicated. And so I think pay attention to whether your president is a new president and whether this new president, to the consortium at least, has any experience with genuine collaboration rather than just sitting on an association or just being part of a larger group that doesn't really need to advance any strategic priorities together.
Karina, any comments before we move on to learning objective 2?
I would say that my final comment is that I would say that each of those 10 presidents who comprise my consortium would define my role differently. Because I am a different executive director for each of those presidents. They need different things from me. And so part of my job is to really get to know them, whether that is they've just relocated to the city and their spouse needs to be connected. What's that spouse, and what are their interests, and what are their needs, and those sorts of things. Or, you know, are they needing introduced into the foundation community, which again, we're very foundation rich in the city of Pittsburgh. Do they need connections within, you know, the mayor's office, the county executive office, and other sorts of things that happen? So I would say that I'm described differently because I need to be different for each of them.
Yeah.
Excellent point. Agility, that one way to interpret your comments. Thank you, Karina. Let's move on to learning objective 2. And again, an opportunity for the audience to reflect on this particular learning objective, recognizing the underlying dynamics of turnover. And two questions that we would ask you to reflect upon. What factors have led to presidential turnover at member institutions within your consortium? And what did you learn from observing those factors? Let's take a couple of seconds to think about those. The questions prepared for the panel relative to Learning Objective 2 are: how do relationships affect the impact of presidential turnover? How does the interplay of risk and reward affect the impact? And how can a director create consortium value that will survive presidential turnover? Carole is going to take the lead with Learning Objective 2.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. So when I look at that Learning Objective 2, I think the first thing I want to say is, contrary to the really clever title of this webinar, you can't president-proof your consortium, right? You can't president-proof anything. Anybody who works with presidents knows that, and I say that with great fondness and respect for them. And so I think it's really important. I really love these questions, which really get at relationships and impact, because that's where we do have the ability to control and make a difference when we have leadership transitions. I want to pick up on Karina's observation that each of her president defines her role differently. And I want to link that to this third panel question, which is about value. Your value to the presidents is the key. It is the glue for your consortium. It's important to understand what they value, separate from you, how they will see you as valuable, and how you can build that sense of value. And so I'll just make a couple quick points. One is that, in the 5 years I was at ACTC, I worked with 7 different presidents, and not one of them expected the same thing from me in a one-on-one. They, some of them were really impatient. They had 12 minutes and they wanted me to come in with 4 bullet points and, get off their calendar. Others wanted to go to lunch and have long, kind of intellectual, engaging conversations. I want to say something like, when a new president comes in, it's important to get in front of them early and often. And I think there's a little bit of a truth in that, but I think it's more important to get in front of them in ways that they will find value. So to the extent that you can maintain relationships with the president's cabinet and get the cabinet to help you understand how the president is responding on campus. How does she like to have her time spent? How does she like to run meetings? What does she think about collaboration? What insights can the cabinet share with you about her sense of the value of the consortium? And really use that social capital that you have with the cabinets to figure out the best way to connect with each individual president in a way that establishes a value that will feel to them authentic and individual. And then the second point I want to make is also something I think Karina mentioned earlier. Sometimes you have a champion. You have a president who is a real champion for your organization. Use that person. Help that person understand that, a cocktail party or a breakfast meeting or something with a new president where they have specific talking points about the value of the consortium will give the new president a sense of peer-to-peer value and not just executive director to president value. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Todd.
Yes, thank you for those points. I echo each of them. I think maybe a couple of points that I'll just perhaps add to. One of them, and I think you were getting at this, is that in addition to them seeing value in the consortium, I think explicitly allowing them to see how the consortium is going to add value to whatever their individual goal might be. I do think that particularly presidents who aren't used to working in a consortium environment, when they're starting, they may have one sense of a consortium of what it's there to do. But I think immediately letting that person know that you were there to add and to contribute to the overall goal of that individual institution. So the favorite radio station of every president when they walk in the door is WIIFM, what's in it for me? And even though they may not necessarily be be broadcasting that publicly, I think that that is the orientation, because they of course have goals that they want to see accomplished and see their institution advance. So to the extent that you can explicitly share with them that you understand what their priorities are, and to demonstrate to them exactly how the consortium is working to support those, not only for that institution, but also collectively. I think that that's really important. A lot of presidents will say, rah, 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 it's great I'm in this consortium, but I think allowing them to see that. Now, I do think the question about staff and the cabinet is really important here, and this dynamic about the relationship and understanding that. So as I suggested in the previous comment, not to say that some staff members or those that will remain have access to grind or et cetera, but I do think having some level of sensitivity and really understanding what that looks like. In the interim period, at least in the immediate interim period, that first year of a new president coming on board, it's really it's an opportunity for staff members, cabinet members to be in somewhat of a purgatory. They don't know, are they going to heaven or are they going to hell? Will they remain or will they not remain? And I think being sensitive and understanding that dynamic, and allowing them an opportunity of understanding where they're coming from and demonstrating some sensitivity to that, I think is also important.
Thank you, Todd. Karina?
Well, I thought I'd give an example of something that that I've done over the last year and a half that I've been able to hand over to a new president to sort of point to, whether it's to an internal board or to the public, so that we all know that the cost of higher education is in the news. It's prevalent to all sorts of student debt and those types of conversations. The schools in Pennsylvania, the higher education system, if you will, is amongst the most expensive in the U.S., and we have the highest level of student debt. And so our presidents are feeling pressure around collegiate basic needs, food insecurity, and housing insecurity. And so what I did as a consortium leader is I partnered with leaders across their institutions. With the blessings of the president, we got a small grant to do a study. All 10 schools participated in that study. It was launched publicly. We had a press event. So the foundation community that supported that study was involved. The Pittsburgh Community Food Bank, which is the large distribution level, center. Again, all of the sort of leadership for the city of Pittsburgh sort of rallied around this particular cause. And so when I had a couple of new presidents coming on board, they really had something to point to that was a real positive that was happening within their own higher education institutions. So within the last year, they've all launched food banks. They're putting together advisory committees. They have early warning, formalizing early, warning and risk programs. So that's just one example, and it's hard to sort of encapsulate in, a couple of minutes of explanation. But with a $15,000 grant from a foundation, we were able to parlay that into a sort of massive kind of movement within our city and county across our institutions.
Carole, Todd, any other thoughts to share or any reactions to Karina's comments?
One thing I would add, I was part of ACL when we started the Summer Institute, and I think Barb McFadden from CIC did some work with Jason Saul and Mission Measurement in Chicago, and from her work came a really excellent series of resources about how to communicate value to your board or to your stakeholders. So for those of you who haven't seen that work or haven't attended the Institute, I found those strategies, which is basically ways of kind of condensing and consolidating what you do that's important and making sure that you're communicating it back outward in meaningful ways. Really important. You can have all the value you want, and you can have strong relationships and social capital with the cabinets, but if your presidents can't say in a couple of short sentences what the value is that the consortium adds, then you're missing an opportunity.
Thank you, Carole. Let's move on to learning objective 3. I want to make sure that we have sufficient time to talk about proactive measures that leaders can utilize when responding to presidential turnover.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start this question off. And really, I think this is the true test of a consortium. That is,
Todd, can we let's give the audience 20 seconds.
oh, sorry.
No, sorry to cut you off there. Let's give the audience 20 seconds to reflect upon these 2 questions. What is the first thing you do when a new president takes office? What is the first thing you do when you learn of a president's departure? Todd, you're on.
Yes, so thank you for that. I think this is really at the meat of what we do in a consortium, and that is the ability to provide stability in the face of this changeover. I know that in the United States, in the Constitution, for example, there are lots of attributes that are associated with ensuring that we have a seamless transition. And that the country can continue to function, that people are going to continue to get their Social Security checks or whatever the case might be. Well, I'd liken that to what happens when we have a leadership change in a consortium. Our government, or we must go on. And so while we expect that there are going to be some changes along the way, it's really important that we have the systems and structures in place that will be needed in order for us to provide a certain level of resilience, but also so that critical services and functions aren't interrupted. So we have to be prepared for that as leaders of consortia. So including being able to engage the new president in understanding what it is that we do. I think Karina's point and Carole's point about just being pithy. I think one important aspect that I want to share is that you do want to get the new president on board pretty immediately and allow them to have some level of talking points, but you also don't want to overwhelm them. So I would definitely make sure that, as you understand, a new president is overloaded with a ton of information, and the consortium and how it operates is just really, that probably is not at the very top of the agenda. So I'm a big believer in a 1-pager or a 2-pager. And that is, what are the critical things that that person needs to know on day 1? And then what are the things that they're going to need to know 45 days or 90 days down the road? And what would you like them to know in a year down the road? And I think by phasing those kind of aspects out, of course, you're going to be in a position to respond, but being very deliberate about providing information in a way that people can process it. So some of the things, of course, that you'll want to communicate would be that here are the key elements of the strategic plan. I'm not going to go over the whole strategic plan, but here are the top things that we're working on as we're moving forward. At a very high level, this is our budget and this is how we're staffed. And then ultimately, here are the kind of current initiatives that we're working on, but you also want to let the president know that these initiatives were influenced by the presidents themselves, and you're looking forward to hearing his or her influence and input in terms of how you're shaping that in the future. You definitely want to make sure that they have room for understanding and just being able to set the stage that you're here to advance their goals as well, but at the same time, that there are programs and projects that the consortium is working on and that needs to continue to move forward. So I'm going to just pause there. And Karina, do you want to take a stab at this? Add anything to what I've suggested?
Sure. I know we had done some pre-work together as a group, and we really were talking about the importance of onboarding and how that looks different, across whether the type of institution, how that president left. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the things that I really do to take into consideration. I do want to know, I think it's incredibly important how a president left an institution, what was happening at that campus climate. Are there fiscal or financial sort of strains that are happening? Where's the strain happening? Is it enrollment admissions? Are they under notification Do they have OCR complaints? Those types of things. Are they? Do they have accreditation issues? And then who was brought into the role? What's their background? I really I'm sure all of us do, take a lot of time to do a lot of research on the incoming president and their background, and you start getting a sense of why they're brought in to meet the challenges that are happening. And then, you know, I also, when I'm interviewing and sitting down with a new president, an incoming president, really start asking them questions on that current strategic plan, because oftentimes that institution's in the middle of a strategic plan that the prior president had implemented. And so you start asking questions about what are their plans. Are they going to sort of sit back, do a discovery tour, a listening tour, and then do their own sort of plan, or or is it an internal hire and they're pulled up into the president's role, and are they committed to implementing and staying faithful and true to the current strategic plan, and then really understanding what they need most. And each president has told me that they need different things and different connections and different stability. So it is, you know, I'm a party of one. I don't even have an admin. And what I can tell you is the thing that makes me most proud is when a president calls me to ask me where to go for something. And that means that my role is as a connector has been established. And that goes for their provost, that goes for their chiefs of police, that goes for their CFOs and so forth. So Carole, you want to add anything?
Yeah, actually, I want to build on your comments about the strategic plan. So you'll have some sort of strategy or strategic plan for your consortium, and it's no surprise that the president is going to care more about their institution's strategic plan. And so one of the best ways I found to bridge that is to enlist the support of the cabinet members that are helping onboard the president. So in addition to whatever onboarding you're going to do as the executive director for the consortium, if you can get the new president's vice presidents to say, hey, here are the things I'm working on our strategy for our college, and here are those specific ways the consortium is helping me meet the goals of our current strategic plan, so that they can start to link what they might perceive as their strategy with what you probably perceive as our strategy, and see how those two things fit together.
Yeah, I really love those points about making those connections with campus stakeholders. And I'll just also add that, you know, Karina, your point about the president coming and asking you, I'd also look beyond stakeholders. So, you know, if there are things that are going on, Karina, I know you mentioned earlier about making connections to people civically. I think that's also important. But I also think that it's important for not only you to talk about the consortium, and maybe not some of those campus stakeholders, but others as well. So if there are other people who can speak about the consortium and the value that it creates, I think that, of course, you're going to want the new president to understand externally, you know, if there are values or if there are opportunities where you brought in funding, for example, to support programs, because that's almost a source of external validation. And I think oftentimes new presidents respond to that as well. Thank you.
I want to add one thing, and I don't think this is unique to the city of Pittsburgh, but we have a number of priorities as a city, county, and as a region. One of them is a gap in our workforce. And certainly there's different sector growth. We have certain sectors that are sort of being phased out, and we're now a new big tech and AI sector or center. We have, as a region, we have the Allegheny Conference really encompasses all of the business leaders and community, and it's a very incredibly powerful organization. The Chamber of Commerce is under there, the Pittsburgh Regional Alliance, and the Pennsylvania Economy League of Greater Pittsburgh, and the Allegheny Conference of Community Development are all under this umbrella. And one of the things that I do for new presidents is I know what all the current studies are that are happening for the region and the policy conversations that are happening at the leadership level across the business sector and the political spheres. And so I send them all of the current sort of studies that are happening. They may be getting them internally as well, but I also try to give them talking points about how Peachy and their particular institution, how I've observed that they're rolling up and supporting those regional objectives. And I actually heard one president in a public he was on a public roundtable event, and he was newer, and he was using my talking points. He's new to Pittsburgh, but he had talking points ready to go, and that was told me, okay, I'm onto something here. I was able to give him something that was meaty and meaningful to the foundation, the community, and the political leaders that were in the room, the business leaders. He had those talking points ready to go.
And you created value for that president. That's just one example.
One example.
Right. Carole, Todd, other thoughts about this learning objective, identifying proactive measures?
Not for me.
Can I say something not very Pollyanna-ish, just kind of truthful and honest from my perspective? We worked really hard at ACTC to survive presidential transitions, and we didn't. And so the one thing I want to say is that sometimes that's okay. Sometimes that's what happens. And that is not to undermine this conversation at all, because I think there is a lot you can do to prevent that from happening, and a lot you can do to make sure that your presidents, when they come on board, see your value, see it quickly, and kind of get with the program. But in our case, there were 2 presidents who were not interested, and one of them was not even new. And so I guess my message would be, if that happens, one, you'll be fine, and proof you'll be fine. But also, it might be just okay. And so do your best to mitigate against it, and then kind of roll with whatever happens. Now we can get back to being cheerful.
Well, no, you've opened that door. Can I ask a follow-up question then? Reflecting back, what do you think, what would come to mind as the single greatest lesson that you learned? What was your most helpful takeaway from what you experienced that you're willing and able to share?
Yeah, so, well, that's a really great question, Jim. So I would say, I'll allude to how I started. When I was hired in 2010, the board was not satisfied with what the consortium was doing, and they wanted the consortium to do more. And we did amazing things. We won awards, we grew, we were amazing, and it wasn't enough. And so I think my key takeaway is, and it's kind of, it led me to say what I said, there was no success that was going to convince 2 presidents of financially stable schools with no enrollment problems and deep endowments that they should partner with 3 schools that did not have deep endowments, that annually had enrollment struggles. And there were presidential dynamics that I could do nothing about, that had to do with ego and confidence about the kind of institution you were leading versus the kind of institution someone else might be leading, and whether you wanted those other people to be your peers. So my key takeaway was, you can do your damnedest and you can do your best, and you can still be an A student, but at the end of the day, that what's going to be is what's going to be. And I truly believe we did everything we could do. We just had 2 partners who weren't interested, and sometimes divorces happen, and divorces happened.
Mm-hmm.
Todd, it sounds like you might want to comment.
Yeah, well, I think that is very well said. I do want to mention one other kind of thing, and I think this is somewhat of a basic thing, but I do think it's just worth noting, is that staying out of the politics and out of the gossip is really important. So you definitely, sometimes when there is a presidential turnover, oftentimes there's palace intrigue. And of course, we're all curious about wanting to know what it is, but I think also making sure to not contribute to that. We definitely want to not, it's important for you to know dynamics and what happens. But on the other hand, you definitely don't want to get in any way, not only the reputation, but it being presumed that you said or added in any way to it. So that even though that goes without saying, I think it needs to be said. The other thing that I think that goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway, is, and this is related, and this is the dynamics with individual boards of trustees at each of the individual institutions. And in some cases, I know in my case, there may be times when a board member may reach out to me just because I may know them from a previous life or experience. And just maintaining that firewall, making sure that I'm honoring the fact that I work for the presidents and not for individual trustees. I think that's really important. We all know that boards of trustees have their own dynamics, and just making sure that we stay above and out of it is something that I want to make sure that we always keep in the front of our minds.
I want to echo Todd's point. Your role as a leader of a consortium, be an informed and trusted advisor. Are not going to be trusted if you're in the fray, but if you don't know what the fray is, you're not going to be informed. So it's a balance, but I think he's absolutely right. Be informed and maintain your trust and your credibility.
Carole, we're having a little trouble hearing you. I don't know if it's maybe your distance from the mic or just your voice volume, but thank you, Carole.
Sure.
Karina, thoughts, reflections, reactions to comments from Carole?
I just I'm sure everyone on, listening in on this is sort of laughing in their head, sort of thinking through all the tap dancing that we've done in meetings and social events and questions that have been posed to us, and we don't know anything, or we're not letting it on. But also there's a balance, again, also with the internal dynamics of an institution. So you might be working with academic affairs and the public safety office and the procurement office and so forth. And your president may be asking you about observations about their own team too. And there's always this balance of how much information do you give, how honest can you be, and then, because you have key stakeholders at a lot of different levels. So it feels like we're constantly navigating a minefield of issues that could go the wrong way.
Well put, navigating minefields. That's one concept that did not come up in the research I completed a couple of years ago. So thank you for adding that, Karina. So what I heard during the last couple minutes that from Carole, that some of the presidents did not see the, I'm going to say ROI, the return on investment. They just didn't see the need. They didn't see the value. They didn't understand where there might be some return on investment for their institutions. I also want to pick up on, and I think the panelists did an excellent job pulling it together, but my interpretation of staying out, well, it's kind of the notion of being in but not of, staying outside the politics, outside the gossip, but yet knowing what the politics are, knowing what the gossip is, I think is an excellent point and great insight. You want to be aware of what those issues are. It's a source of intel, but yet you don't want to get dragged into the middle of it. Great ideas, great concepts, I think. And also, I think Todd mentioned the concept of the firewall, that you can only go so far, and then you have to stop, whether it's self-imposed or imposed by someone else. But I think really excellent concepts. And really, diving deep into that dynamic, we're talking about relationships, we're talking about judgment, we're talking about intuition, and how, again, the leader has to be agile and know when to push, when to pull back. Excellent comments, thank you. Any other thoughts from the three of you before we move to audience Q&A?
Let's go.
Let's go. All right, we have a few questions lined up.
Yes, Jim, we actually have 3 questions. The first one would be from Beth. What strategies would you suggest to encourage collaborative leadership behaviors among new presidents as they negotiate their new roles?
Can I take a first stab at this?
Yes.
One of the things that we did at ACTC that I am really proud of and never would have imagined was a need was to establish for committees kind of the rules of engagement. And this happened when I would meet with the CFOs and they would say, oh my goodness, those provosts, they don't understand anything about business. I would meet with the provost and they would say, oh, those CFOs, they don't understand anything about academics. And I pulled them together and I said, we have to knock it off. Right? We can't talk about each other this way or we're never going to get anything done. And it was nicer than that, but that was my message. And what we ended up doing was, as a group of 11 people, establishing our guidelines for collaboration. They were behavioral guidelines and communication guidelines. And you know, I don't remember them off the top of my head, but I remember one of them giving anyone at the table to say, someone who was going off the rails, you know, you're not behaving according to our accepted behavior. And the group became really good at monitoring itself, and I started being able to convene those 2 committees together and actually making progress. Once that strategy worked, I started doing it with all of our committees. And so I would say with presidents, probably not as formally, I don't know that they would have wanted me to lead them through developing talking points per se or behaviors, but getting the group to jointly establish their rules of engagement, how they're going to treat each other, how they're going to communicate, what they're going to share. It's not so much what those rules are as the process of establishing them together that really builds that sense of buy-in and being together at the table.
Karina, Todd, any thoughts or reflections on the question submitted by Beth?
Nothing more than what has already been stated. I thought Carole did a nice job of addressing those.
Well, let's move on to the next question from Mickey. All 3 of you are at city-based consortia. What do you think might be some differences for regional or national consortia? Do the rules change? Does the game change? Do your thoughts, suggestions, might they have to be adapted depending upon the nature of the consortium?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at answering that. And I definitely think that yes and no. So yes, no, the rules don't change, because in terms of the principles about a succession and when that occurs, so for example, making sure that you have the documentation, making sure that the president understands what the consortium does, the value, those types of things don't change. However, we did spend a fair amount of time talking about personalities and the importance of that, not only the presidents, but also at the cabinet level. And even in other cases, even further down from that. So for example, it could be registrars who may need to communicate and they may be in distant places. So I'd say that having a rapport and getting the presidents to establish a rapport may be a little bit more difficult than or easier than others. So let me just say that I'm here in Atlanta, and our 4 colleges are literally connected to each other. But please don't assume that just because that we are on the same geographical footprint, that our presidents meet any more often than what a set of rural presidents would have an opportunity to meet. They might see each other at a Rotary meeting. And so I wouldn't necessarily assume that there is a specific disadvantage, but you definitely want to have an opportunity for them to build a rapport. And at the end of the day, you want to make sure that you get the best from all of them. They're all very smart people. And what a wonderful opportunity that we each have to be able to pull from the best of those individuals, and the power of that collective thinking is something that can't be understated. So looking for those opportunities, and when they do get together, making sure that you build in opportunities for social time, or that you have opportunities where different people, different presidents can showcase their knowledge or perspective, whether it's not necessarily in a subject matter, but it could be about leadership, or it could be about organizational development. And so being able to allow opportunities for people to come together, not only socially, but also to discuss subjects that don't fall within a particular president's domain or wheelhouse.
I want to second that. I've been doing some work with the Women's College Coalition, and we've been convening at a certain place. And what I've noticed, we only convene irregularly. We're not a formal consortium. But what I recognize when we get together is that we need more time to get to know each other than the presidents at ACTC ever did. Right? There was just a naturalness when you're in proximity and you do share some geography or you share some of those things. So building in the time to get to know each other really enables part two, the next most important thing for me, which is understanding what you can do together that you can only do because you're together. But people can't get there in a group of people they don't know. So make time for them to become familiar with each other, and then get really focused on how they can all maximize the time they're spending together, especially since president's time is so valuable. It's such a rare commodity.
You know, what you both said, it's just, those are such important points. And I think it is very different for city-based consortia versus a regional or national. I think it would be much harder to sort of, you know, be having a scattershot kind of assembling of your institutions. However, our leaders, whether they're your provost or your president or your CFOs or your general counsel, they're all going somewhere and having conferences and meeting at, you know, sort of national association events, and they're part of associations. And you know, I find opportunities to convene them and sponsor maybe, you know, a social event together, even when they're away from us. And that's what I would do if I were approaching it as a regional, national level, and also to lift them up and publish or be committed to a sort of an initiative that'll get them national recognition, and then submit on their behalf, you know, a submission for a conference where they're presenting together. Those are the kinds of things that I do locally, but I would do that as a regional, national level as well.
I want to make sure that we also address Deanna's question. I mean, in some ways, she's posing the same question as Mickey did, but maybe a slightly different spin or a different perspective. Is there any advice for surviving turnover for a consortia whose members are not co-located, in other words, spanning multiple states and already disconnected? Very similar to Mickey's question, but I mean, the way that Deanna has worded it, does it bring to mind any other thoughts, other ideas that you would like to share? I think you've covered that topic pretty well. I just want to give you a chance to respond to Deanna's question in case anything else comes to mind. We have one more question submitted by an audience member. You've aptly described how to engage cabinets. In what ways do you engage or leverage other member presidents in reaching out to a new president? I think one of you may have touched on this briefly during comments earlier in the webinar. That was my commentary. Sorry about that. Not part of Kieran's question. But he finishes by saying, I'm particularly curious about your tactics when the new president doesn't seem particularly receptive to your message. So really, Kieran's question deals with reaching out to new presidents. How might you have to change your tactic? How might you have to change your strategy if that new president seems somewhat reluctant to be engaged?
I'll tackle this first. You know, I'm only as good as the relationships I have with these presidents, right? And as effective. And so I am so lucky that I have a number of presidents who I have great relationships with. They are all in as far as the value add for Peachy. And can very clearly articulate the value of Peachy to a new president. And so I do call and ask for advice on how to get that new president engaged. And I will ask for a favor, like for them to reach out to have a lunch date or a meeting or that kind of thing. And I will have them be the one that invites the new president maybe to a panel, to sit on a panel that's a high profile event locally, or those sorts of things. So I think that sometimes that's the only sort of trick in my bag that I have sometimes to get a new president who's disinterested to get connected.
I would add to that, relationships are everything, and relationships president to president are important. And this is a place where your role as somebody who is both informed and trusted is really important. If you're going to engage another president to help you with a president who's slow to being onboarded, let's say, you have to choose that relationship really well. So, one of the challenges that I had at my consortium was that there were a couple of institutions who had really different self-perceptions than the way they perceived a couple of the other institutions, which meant that it would have been terrible to try and connect. No matter my relationship with those presidents, they wouldn't have connected well with a president at an institution that they felt above, if I can say that. That's probably a little bit too black and white. But to really get a president who can build a relationship with a president who needs help onboarding is probably more important than getting any president. I think you can make the wrong choice if you don't pay attention to those president-to-president dynamics.
Yeah.
Todd, we have about 1 minute left before I want to finish up some housekeeping slides. So please go ahead.
Yeah. So this is a tough one because there are a couple things that can be unpacked here. One is that in some cases they just may not like each other. So I've been in a situation where that is the case, and it may have been, it may have been some of the things that you just talked about, Carole, but it also just may have just been that there have been personality differences, and so it's really hard to overcome that. I just still believe in really creating the value. Let me end by sharing this conversation that I had with my presidents when I first took the role, and that is, do you find value in having this other institution or these other institutions as part of the consortium? And that, I don't think that the presidents had actually been asked that question, like, how does this help you? And I think by starting off that conversation with each of them, that allowed them to reflect, to say they do, these, whether or not they answered that question, it was really a rhetorical one, but allowing them to probe themselves to say, I am stronger because this institution is part of this, or this adds, 5% to what I'm doing, but it is additive. And just allowing them to kind of come to that conclusion on their own, I think, is really important.
Convincing them that you're able to do more together.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Todd. Thank you, Carole. Thank you, Karina. This has been excellent. As predicted, the time went by very quickly. We sincerely do appreciate your participation and sharing your insight. Just a couple housekeeping slides that I want to finish up with. Just a recap of our learning objective. Hopefully our discussion has been spot on with the 3 different learning objectives of understanding the impact, recognizing underlying dynamics, and articulating proactive measures. Some supplemental information. Don't forget about referencing the handout that was distributed to registrants for today's webinar. A white paper is scheduled to be published this month focusing on this topic, and access to related research is available at the link provided. And then again, please do not forget to complete the survey related to today's webinar. Here's contact information if you wish to reach out to any of the panelists, including myself. And again, this has been a production of the Association for Collaborative Leadership Virtual Professional Development Committee. And also my special thanks to Tim Newcomb in the background, navigating us through this and making sure that all of the technical requirements are in place. And as I say that, Tim, can you think of any other final items that we need to cover before we finish up today?
No, I just wanted to highlight that we do have past webinars that focus on communicating your value on our website. We have been in transition and moving information from one website platform to another, and I'm going to verify that all that information is up there for you. If you have any questions about that, you can contact any one of us or me directly, and we'll get that information to you.
And
Thank you.
actually, there's one important thing that we did not cover that needs to get covered, and that is thank you to Jim. Thank you for your leadership in making this all happen. To the participants out there in participant land, this is not an easy thing to do. So thank you for making this happen.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Jim.
You're welcome. My pleasure. This has been a lot of fun. I enjoyed it. Thank you so much.